Okay.
Greetings everyone. I'm very happy to introduce once again a man whom everybody I think has come to discover has an incredible head on his shoulders. Gerald Therrien has been a longtime friend, a collaborator with the Rising Tide Foundation, has done some pioneering work on deep history, culture, literature that ties in or answers a bunch of questions that most people have thought were unanswerable pertaining to who was the real King Arthur. What's up with Marlowe and Shakespeare and these strange parallels of thinking in both of these gentlemen, and how does that play into the court intrigue of England at the time of a major period of transformation, which are two recent classes that Jerry has done and have been explosively important for the field of universal history more broadly. And within that context, Jerry, I know for quite some time, has been chewing on this particularly important figure named Geoffrey Chaucer. And he's been writing little insights over the last couple of years into different aspects of Chaucer's mind that I found provocative, but nothing really that pulled together the quality of of uh, of a story that I think we're about to experience today about what was Chaucer actually doing with his stories, with the Canterbury Tales, with what was the period of history that Chaucer was living in, that he situated himself as a direct part of. What was he intervening on to either expose or to make better? So Jerry, thank you so much for doing this. I'm looking forward to this entire conversation, this lecture, and obviously the dialogue process that we always do is going to follow with an open discussion, and people who have questions, like usual, I ask you to pop your name in the chat box, and I will call upon you in the discussion period. It is all yours, Jerry.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And thanks, Cynthia, too, for letting me do this. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Matt, because I did do a earlier presentation on King Arthur, and I also did one on Marlowe. And this one, I think it's the key missing piece that connects the two. That's what I'm trying to do. So bear with me. Now I'll try to do my screen share. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. There. Okay. So today I want to talk about a wonderful Englishman named Geoffrey Chaucer and the last night in England. Now, some months ago, a while ago actually, I was searching through the used book section of a thrift store when I came across a painting, actually, a copy of this painting that you see as my first slide. And it was a painting showing all the people who went on the pilgrimage to Canterbury, as was told in a book called The Tales of Canterbury by Geoffrey Chaucer. And I really liked this painting, and my wife let me buy it. I think it was $5 or something. And it's hanging on the wall behind me. You'll be able to see it later. And I started wondering about this painting. And later I found that it was done by an English painter named Thomas Stothard. And, well, this is good. It turns out in 1778, a young 22-year-old Thomas Stothard became a student at the Royal Academy in London, which means that he studied with Matt's good friend, Benjamin West. So now I was even more curious about this. And I started wondering about who were these people and why are they going to Canterbury? And I bought a copy of the Tales of Canterbury, actually a translation of it into modern English. And I started reading. And to make a long story short, now I'm going to talk about what I learned about Geoffrey Chaucer and about the first tale in the book, The Knight's Tale. That's the only one I'm going to talk about today. Now, here are just the first few lines from the general prologue at the start of the Tales of Canterbury. And in these opening lines, I want to show both the original Old English of Chaucer, that's in italics, and a modernization version that brings Chaucer's Old English into modern English. There's a lot of different modernizations around, but the one that I'm going to use is one done by Mr. A.S. Klein, Tony Klein. I like this one because it's a book that I happen to have found and bought, but also because it's easy to read, and especially because Klein tries to keep Chaucer's meter and his rhyming, and I think that's very important. Okay, I'm going to try to read it in Old English. Please forgive me. When at April with his surest sota, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vena in sich liquor, of which vertu engendered is the fluor. Van Zephyrus eke with his sveta breath, his spirit hath in every halt and hath. So you kind of get an idea of the Old English. And I don't know about you, but have you ever thought about where the English language that we speak today came from? So in school, we were told that at one time there was an indigenous Celtic language spoken by a people called Bretons. And later we're told that Breton was invaded by the Romans, and so this Celtic got mixed in with a bit of Latin. Then we're told when the Romans left, some Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, invaded, and some Germanic words got mixed in there too. And this became the beginnings of the language spoken by the Angles that was called Anglish. But when the Normans invaded, some French words got mixed into this Anglish as well. Now, in the England of Chaucer's time, Norman French was spoken at court and by the nobility, and Latin was the language used in the church and in the universities. And this Anglish was the language spoken by the lower classes. It has been said that for Chaucer to write his poetry in English, he had to invent new words and new phrases that he borrowed from the French and Italian and even the Latin. And he also had to fit them for the tongue of the English speakers. So Chaucer took this vernacular English and made it into a language for the common person, a language that could tell stories and that could convey new ideas. Now, Geoffrey, hang on a second. Just got to move some things so I can see my slides. Okay. Geoffrey Chaucer was born sometime around the year 1343. We're not sure the day or the year. He was the son of a wine merchant in London, and he lived there during the years of the Black Death. He was schooled at St. Paul's, and he learned Latin, French, and Italian, so that by the age of 14, he became a page to the wife of Prince Lionel. At 16, Chaucer accompanied Prince Lionel on King Edward III's expedition against France. And during the campaign, Chaucer was taken prisoner, and he was later ransomed to get back to England. Afterwards, he studied law at one of the Inns of Court to prepare for a future career, and then he became a squire to King Edward III. At 23, he was sent to Spain during a battle over Spanish succession, where England supported Pedro and France supported Enrique. And the next year, Chaucer would marry Philippa Roet, a lady in waiting of the Queen of England. Let's see. My slides don't want to move down. There. In 1368, Chaucer was sent as a servant of Prince Lionel to Milan for Lionel's wedding to Violante Visconti. She was the daughter of the Duke of Milan, and where it is said that Chaucer met Petrarch. Very important. And it was around this time that Chaucer became friends with Prince John of Gaunt, he's called. And after the death of Prince John's first wife, Chaucer would write a poem called The Book of the Duchess as a consolation to him on the death of his wife. Now, I just want to note that some years later, Prince John's third wife, Catherine, was the sister of Philippa, Chaucer's wife. And so Prince John and Geoffrey Chaucer became brothers-in-law. In 1372, Chaucer was sent as part of a trade mission to Genoa in Italy, and he also got to visit Florence, where he was able to learn about Dante and his book they called the Divine Comedy, and where it is said that he met Boccaccio, the writer of the Decameron that he called the Human Comedy. And this is important because it's this Italian influence, meeting Petrarch and Boccaccio, that helped Chaucer in his attempts at a beginning of an English school of poetry. In 1374, Chaucer became a controller of the wool customs in the port of London. And now, having more time at home and less time at court, he could write new poems like The House of Fame, and another poem, one of my favorites, about St. Valentine's Day. I think it was the first poem where it talks about St. Valentine's Day. It's called The Parliament of the Birds, because I like birds. In 1378, Chaucer was sent on another mission to the Lord of Milan, where Chaucer would have experienced this Lord's great library, and where he again became acquainted with the poetical works of Petrarch and Boccaccio. Petrarch had died a few years earlier in 1374, and Boccaccio died the next year in 1375. So 1378 is the time of this visit. And Chaucer brought back to England with him some copies of Petrarch's poems and Boccaccio's poems, including Boccaccio's Decameron, which is a book about 10 people who took shelter in a villa to escape from the Black Death. And to pass the time, each night, each person must tell a story. And this would give Chaucer the idea for writing his Tales of Canterbury that he would spend the next 20 years working on. But before we go into the tales, I just want to go back and look at what was happening in England under the Norman kings before Chaucer wrote the Tales of Canterbury. This might seem a little tedious, but I hope you can follow it. So the First Crusade. Now, this is interesting. It seems that there were no knights in England before the Norman conquest by William the Conqueror in 1066, when the invading Normans brought their system of feudalism and its doomsday book to merry old England, along with their knights, who accompanied their feudal lords around to assert command of their new fiefdoms. 30 years later, in 1096, the First Crusade would be led by the Normans from Normandy in France, the Normans from Sicily. The Pope had invited them to come to Sicily and take over, and the Normans of England. And this first crusade was to apparently protect pilgrims to the Holy Land, who actually needed no protection at that time. Along with this institution of knighthood, the Norman concocted myths of the Knights of the Round Table were later brought to England, starting with the romantic writings of Chrétien of Troyes, through the Norman Queen of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, that tried to subvert the historic and heroic tale of King Arthur by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, in Chrétien's last romance, called Percival, is the first mention of the myth of the quest for the Holy Grail. So that's where that crap comes from. And the second crusade. Now, I just want to go into Eleanor of Aquitaine a bit. Eleanor of Aquitaine had been the Queen of France when she married the king, Louis VII. And she had traveled with him to the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. But a few years after their return to France, King Louis was granted a divorce from Eleanor after she failed to give him a male heir. And a few months later, this 28-year-old Eleanor then married to the young 19-year-old Henry Plantagenet, who was the Duke of Normandy, but a few years later, he became King Henry II of England, and Eleanor now would become the Queen of England. Later, after providing Henry with 8 children, Eleanor returned to her home in France, in Aquitaine, where her court became a center for the troubadours. And one of Eleanor's daughters, with Louis VII of France, before they got a divorce, her name was Marie. And Marie would be married off to Henry, the Count of Champagne. And Count Henry had traveled in the Second Crusade with King Louis and Queen Eleanor. And Count Henry's court was at the city of Troyes, where his wife Marie also became a patron of the troubadours, such as Chrétien de Troyes. That's how he got his name, because he was in that town. And he became the author of the romantic Grail myths of the Knights of the Round Table through these troubadours. Now, Count Henry and Marie's son, Count Henry II, would join the Third Crusade, and he would become the uncrowned king of Jerusalem. That's in 1192. But he died there when he somehow mysteriously fell out of a second-story window in his palace. Maybe all these romantic and cultish tales for Eleanor's and Marie's court troubadours were used as a recruiting tool for more fresh bodies of knights that were needed for more crusades. And also, they were used to reinforce Norman cultural influence in England under Eleanor's husband, King Henry II. Now the Third Crusade. Now, in the year 1170, supposedly on reports of King Henry II of England, his anger with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury was considered the leader of the Christian church in England, so it was a very important position. And because he was angry with Thomas Becket, 4 knights traveled from London to Canterbury to assassinate Becket. Now, you can imagine the troubles that happened over this when your archbishop gets assassinated. However, as part of the reconciliation between the Pope and Henry II over Becket's assassination, Henry was found to be not guilty of his death, but on the condition he had to swear to go on a crusade. So I guess you can kill the archbishop as long as you promise to go on a crusade. Anyway, shortly afterwards, a few years after, a scheme was launched with the encouragement of his wife, Queen Eleanor, for Henry II's three oldest sons, that was Henry, Geoffrey, and Richard, to revolt against their father's rule in England and in Normandy. His fourth and youngest son, John, supported his father, however, and so became his favorite. Now, after the failure of this revolt by his three oldest sons, Eleanor was forced to return to England. She had been in France, Aquitaine at the time, and she was placed in house arrest for the rest of her life. And Henry II of England and Louis VII of France then agreed to a peace. And at the encouragement of the Pope, they both agreed to undertake a joint crusade. Now, the four assassins of Becket were excommunicated from the church, but they traveled to Rome to seek forgiveness from the Pope. But before they got to Rome, they took part in Eleanor and her son's rebellion against Henry. Now, as a sentence, the Pope sentenced the assassins to go on the coming crusade and to fight for the Knights Templars. So it was a punishment for killing the archbishop. They had to go on a crusade. So it seems that murdering the head of the Church of England could be overlooked if you only agreed to go on a crusade. Now, after the death of his two older brothers, Henry and Geoffrey, Richard now, and the death of his father Henry, Richard became King of England. And he soon received news of the fall of Jerusalem, and Richard now joined the Third Crusade. And while he was away, his younger brother, John, ruled England. And you can read more about this, about King John and about Eleanor of Aquitaine, in Christopher Marlowe's play, King John. That's what it's all about. Now, one of the four knights who were assassinated Becket, his name was Hugh de Morville, and he fought in Richard's service in the Third Crusade. Now, upon Richard's return to Europe, he was arrested by the Duke of Austria for some reason or disagreement. And Hugh de Morville stood hostage for him, was imprisoned in his place. Now, the story goes that while de Morville was imprisoned, he carried with him some books. Most likely they were copies of de Troyes' romances about the Holy Grail that were then used by a man named Ulrich von Zatzinkoven, who wrote his romance called Lancelot, which furthered these round table myths of the Crusader Knights into German culture. And over the next few decades after von Zatzinkoven's Lancelot, his romance was followed by Gottfried von Strasbourg's Tristan, and then Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, and then an anonymous one called The Song of the Nibelungs. And if these things are starting to sound familiar to you, all of these romances can be found over 600 years later in a Richard Wagner opera. So that should show you where this whole romanticism crap came from. Now, we get to, this is called Lord Edward's Crusade. Sometimes it's called the Ninth Crusade, and it was launched in 1271. Now, during this crusade with the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, Prince Edward of England sought an alliance with the Mongols against the Sultan of Egypt. So it's not really religious when you're allying with the Mongols to fight the sultans. Now, the Sultan of Egypt was actually allied with the Phoenicians and their slave trade out of the Black Sea. That's how the Sultan of Egypt got most of these soldiers for his army. He bought them from the Venetians out of a little area called the Crimea. That's kind of in the news these days. Now, Prince Edward, however, just ended the crusade with a truce with Egypt, but he was almost killed by one of the assassins. And after this, England would not participate in any more crusades. This was their last crusade, Lord Edward's crusade. But shortly before Lord Edward's crusade, back in England, there was a revolt of the Norman barons against his father. And while his father, King Henry III, was held captive, and before Lord Edward was able to free him, the barons called a parliament. It's called Simon de Montfort's Parliament in 1265. And a parliament was convened that for the first time included 2 representatives from each shire, and they were called knights of the shire. And they were elected, and a knight of the shire didn't have to be an actual knight. But before then, you were just appointed. You were a baron, or you were, a head of the church, or you were a knight. But now they finally had elected 2 people from each shire, knights of the shire. But that didn't mean there were no more knights, because in 1348, a little while later, during the years of the Black Death, King Edward III founded the Order of the Garter as his attempt to recreate a modern round table of knights. So as the knighthood thing is kind of dying out, he tries to bring it back. But I bring this up, this whole idea of the Knights of the Shire, because in the year 1386, Geoffrey Chaucer would become a Knight of the Shire for Kent, which is the county where Canterbury is. And shortly after this, Chaucer would begin writing his Tales of Canterbury, about stories told by a group of pilgrims traveling from London to the Shire, to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at the cathedral in Canterbury. So Canterbury seems to be very important in all of this. I want to go over that. Canterbury, first, in the year 595, a missionary named Augustine was sent by the Pope to Christianize the Bretons. And he traveled to Canterbury, and it was there that he began preaching and converting the Wessex kingdom. And so this is how the Bishop of Canterbury came to be considered the head of the Christian church in England, because that's where it started. Now, second, in the year 1170, as we saw, 4 knights traveled from London to Canterbury to assassinate St. Thomas Becket. And it was a few years after this that the myths of the Round Table were launched in Norman France, perhaps to romanticize and justify the actions of these 4 knights, these 4 assassins. And thirdly, although Chaucer would die in the year 1400, the year before he died, in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of Chaucer's good friend and brother-in-law, Prince John of Gaunt, led a revolt against Richard II, and Henry became King Henry IV. And this is important because he became the first king in England who spoke England. He spoke English, sorry, as his native tongue. The English that Chaucer had worked on creating. And when Henry IV died, he would be buried in the Cathedral of Canterbury. And I think that's why Canterbury is so important in all of this. So now let's go to Chaucer's Tale of Canterbury. The first of the tales is told by a knight. Now, it would seem that by the time of these tales, with almost 200 years of knights being killed during the Crusades, and probably with very few squires wishing to follow their mentors and become knights to be killed in the Crusades, and with the Crusader knights in Parliament being replaced by the elected knights of the Shire, there probably weren't too many real knights left alive, except for these aristocratic pretend knights of the Order of the Garter. So maybe this knight in the tales could have been one of the last knights left in England. So let's begin with the prologue. We did before, but I'm going to read the modernized version of it. When that April with his showers sweet, the drought of March has pierced root deep, and bathed every vein with liquor of such power that engendered from it is the flower. When Zephyrus too, Zephyrus was the west wind, when Zephyrus too with his gentle strife to every field and wood has brought new life in tender shoots, and the youthful sun half his course through the ram has run, and little birds are making melody, who all the night with open eye do sleep. Nature their hearts in every way so pricks, then people long to go on pilgrimage. And palmers who seek out foreign strands. A palmer is a person who wore 2 crossed palm leaves in front of himself as a sign he was going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And palmers who seek out foreign strands to far-off shrines renowned in sundry lands, and especially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they wend. The holy, blissful martyr they seek, who had aided them when they were sick. Now, reading that first introduction, just the first 18 lines from it actually, it gave me a different idea of why people went on a pilgrimage. They weren't there to wear a hair shirt or to whip themselves, it's not a pilgrimage as some kind of punishment. But they went because it was spring and the birds were singing and the flowers was growing and a warm breeze was blowing. People were happy. And so then they decided to go on a pilgrimage. It befell that in that season on a day in Southwark at the Tabard, that's the name of the inn, at the Tabard as I lay, ready to set out on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with pious courage, there came at night to that hostelry quite 29 in a company of sundry folk who had chanced to fall into a fellowship, and pilgrims all that towards Canterbury meant to ride. So our poet had stopped at an inn to rest up, so that the next morning he could begin his pilgrimage refreshed. And some other pilgrims stopped at that inn, and while dining with them, our poet agreed to join them on their pilgrimage. And that night after the meal, the host of the tavern said that he would like to accompany them, and he would be their guide. And then he made a proposal. To give each other comfort and mirth along the way, they would each tell stories. And this is what the host says. That each of you, to speed you on your way, on the journey there shall tell 2 tales till Canterbury. I mean it so. and on the homeward way another two, of adventures that did once befall. And which of you that bears them best of all, that is to say, who tells in this case tales the most serious, that most celeste, shall have a supper, and we pay the cost, here in this place, sitting by this post, when that we come again from Canterbury. And to make you all the more merry, I will myself gladly with you ride, all at my own cost, and be your guide. So in the morning, the pilgrims began their journey. And at their first stop, they all drew straws to see who would be the first to tell their tale. And the knight, having drawn the short straw, was to be the first to tell his tale. But first, I want to look at our poet's description of the knight. In the general prologue, he gives a description of each of the people who were on the pilgrimage. So I want to look at his description of the knight to see who this knight was, and also the places in the world that he had seen that our poet mentions in this description of the knight. And in this, you'll see I put these places in bold to point them out. And then later we can find out where they were and what may have been happening there at this time and why Chaucer put these places in this description. So he says, there was a knight, and he a worthy man, that from the day on which he first began to ride abroad had followed chivalry, truth, honor, courtesy, and charity. He had fought nobly in his lord's war, and ridden to the fray, and no man more as much in Christendom as heathen place, and ever honored for his worth and grace. When we took Alexandria, was there. Often at table held the place of honor, above all other nations too in Prussia. Campaigned in Lithuania and Rosenia, no Christian man of his rank more often. At the siege of Algeciras had he been, in Granada, and in Belmara. He was at Ayash and Antalya when taken, and many times had been in action on the Mediterranean Sea. Of mortal battles he had seen 15, and fought for the faith at Trasmacene, thrice in the lists, and always slain his foe. The same worthy knight had been also with the Emir of Balat once, at work with him against some other heathen Turk. Won him a reputation highly prized, and though he was valiant, he was wise, and in his manner modest as a maid. And never a discourtesy he said in all his life to those who met his sight. He was a very perfect, gentle knight. But to tell of his equipment, his array, his horses fine, he wore no colors gay, sported a tunic, padded fustian, on which his coat of mail left many a stain. For he was scarcely back from his voyage, and going now to make his pilgrimage. So our poet gives us this picture of our knight. And he said, our knight not only followed chivalry, but that he followed truth, honor, courtesy, and charity. And our poet says he was known to be valiant, wise, and modest in manner and in dress. So our knight was different than the knights we see in those romantic knight tales. And if you see the names I put in bold, it is said that our knight had just returned from his travels to Alexandria, Prussia, Lithuania, Rosenia, Algeciras, Belmaria, Ayash, Antalya, Trasmacene, and Balat. So now let's look into the history of these places at that time and see if our knight could have been there. Now, this was called the Alexandrian Crusade. After the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1291, the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, we know them today as the Knights of Malta, they found refuge first in the Kingdom of Cyprus. That's this island here, Cyprus. And afterwards, they moved to the nearby island of Rhodes. That's here. In 1347, Pierre, who was going to be the future king of Cyprus, founded the Order of the Sword as part of his plan to recover the lost kingdom of Jerusalem. And a year later, in 1348, Edward III of England founded his Order of the Garter as part of his love of these Crusader myths. So I'm thinking that perhaps our knight fought for Pierre, who would become the French king of Cyprus and the titular heir, king of Jerusalem. So King Pierre and his knights finally launched his Alexandrian crusade from Rhodes in the year 1365. And they first captured Antalya, which is right here, if you can see it, right on the southern end of Turkey. And it was part of one of the small Turkic kingdoms near the island of Rhodes after the breakup of the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuk Empire controlled Turkey, and it broke up into maybe about 10, 20 little kingdoms, and Antalya was one of them. So if our knight was at the siege of Antalya, that our poet says in the prologue, then he was there with King Pierre. And then it is said our knight fought in 3 lists, that's 3 jousts, 3 tournaments, at Trasmacene. You can see there it is right there, which is a small town near Antalya. And after the fall of Antalya, some of the neighboring little kingdoms offered tribute to King Pierre. One of these may have been the Emir of Belat, and that's over here. And because it said our knight was there, and our knight may have fought with the Emir's forces against one of the other small Turkic kingdom. So you could ally with a Muslim kingdom to fight another Muslim kingdom. That was no problem. Then after this, Pierre went to Rome to successfully lobby for more knights that he needed for his crusade and to be blessed by the Pope. Then him and his knights sailed to Egypt, where they captured, sacked, and pillaged Alexandria here from the Mamluk Sultan in Egypt and his mercenary knights. And I had mentioned before, a large part of the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, his army, were Slavs that were sold to him as slaves by the Venetians out of Crimea. But Pierre was forced to withdraw from Alexandria and end his crusade against Egypt. Maybe the Venetians had something to do with that. I don't know. But afterwards, Pierre and his knights sailed back to Turkey again, and they captured another town, an Armenian town named Aeus, which is mentioned in the prologue. And they captured this town from the Mamluks. Now, some historians have shown that this Alexandrian crusade had nothing to do with religion, but was more concerned with redirecting trade away from Alexandria in Egypt towards Cyprus, which would have been to the benefit of Venetians and also the Knights of Malta at Rhodes. So all this to say, if our knight was at the sack of Alexandria and the siege of Aeus, then he was there with Pierre. Now this becomes interesting. After this, Pierre now travels to Rome again to meet the new pope and to try to organize a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. But the new pope, he instead hoped for some kind of a peace between Europe and the Sultan of Egypt. But while he was in Italy, Pierre also attended the marriage of Prince Lionel of England and Violante Visconti, who was the daughter of the Duke of Milan in 1368. And as we saw earlier, Chaucer had accompanied Prince Lionel as one of his servants on that trip to Milan. And he would have seen and possibly met Pierre and his knights. Also, Petrarch attended this wedding as a guest, and it is said that's when he met Chaucer. Now, a few months later, after this wedding, Lionel died. Some say he was poisoned, and Chaucer had to return to England. Pierre was assassinated soon after his return to Cyprus, and the Pope died the next year. So no new crusade, I'm sorry. So with no new crusade in the works, our knight would have left Pierre for new employment, and I think possibly in Spain. And that's a map of the southern part of Spain, and this is the northern tip of Africa, right? There's Gibraltar, and there's Algeciras, and there's Ceuta on the African side. So now our look at Chaucer's life showed that he had been sent to Navarre in Spain a few years before his trip to Italy, where King Edward III began fighting a proxy war against France over who would be the new king of Castile. That's this area and way more in Spain. Pedro was supported by England, or his half-brother Enrique, who was supported by France. So our knight may have entered English service and fought under Prince Edward, who was the son of King Edward III, in support of Pedro. Now, a little side story, but I like this. For his help, Pedro presented Prince Edward with a ruby spinel. Not a ruby, it's a spinel, but they called it ruby-colored spinel, which happened to be the one that Henry V wore on his helmet at the Battle of Agincourt, and the same ruby spinel that would sit on the Tudor crown of King Henry VII. But today it sits at the front, right down here. That's the front of the imperial crown of Britain of King Charles. So it's this ruby spinel is still around. Also, Pedro's daughters would be married off to Prince Edward's younger brothers, Prince John of Gaunt. This would become Prince John's second wife, and also Prince Edmund of Langley. Now, Pedro was also an ally of Mohammed V of Granada. That's here, a place we call Andalusia. And Pedro was much influenced by Andalusian culture. And Pedro spoke fluent Arabic. And he had both Muslim and Jewish courtiers at his court. Now, also another little aside, it should be noted later, this is later on, in the year 1391, while Chaucer was working on his Tales of Canterbury, he wrote a treatise on the astrolabe for his 10-year-old son, Louis. And it is said that he relied on Arabic treatises on the astrolabe that most likely would have come to England through Granada in Spain. So there was this connection between Chaucer and Andalusia. After Pedro was killed by Enrique in 1369, Muhammad I then moved to take control of Algeciras from Enrique down here. It's just on the other side of this bay from Gibraltar. And he laid siege to the city until it fell. The next year, Muhammad V helped to restore his ally, Sultan Hamu, to power in Belmaria. That's this part of Morocco, right here, the northern tip. And then he seized Ceuta, which is a tiny little town here. I think it belongs to Spain now today. So if our knight had fought for Pedro against Enrique, he wouldn't have suddenly switched sides to fight for Enrique and for France, but he must then have continued to fight for Muhammad V in Granada and in Morocco, and that's the references to Algeciras and Belmar. That's in the prologue description of the knight. Now, it seems that next our knight may have traveled to Prussia, which is here, where he was to fight, it is said, in Lithuania and Rosinia. That's this part of it here. The Teutonic Order of Knights, which their official name was the Order of the Hospital of St. Mary in Jerusalem, waged their northern crusades against the so-called pagan Baltic tribes. First, the Prussians, then the Latvians, the Estonians, and then they tried against the Lithuanians. After the knights defeated the Lithuanians at the Battle of Rudowa in 1370, many knights from France and England would journey north to join the Teutonic Knights as they continued their crusade against the Lithuanians. So perhaps our knight was one of these knights. Now, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jagela, he at first thought of converting to Christian Orthodox and marrying the daughter of the Prince of Moscow. But he didn't think that this would stop the Teutonic Order crusade, so instead he decided to convert to Roman Catholic and to marry the daughter of the King of Poland, Jadwiga. And there's a picture of the two of them there. And then when the Pope finally recognized Lithuania as a Catholic state, the Teutonic Crusades finally stopped. So that was his plan, to stop these damn Teutonic Knights. So when you look back at all of this and all of these places, during the 1360s and 1370s, while Chaucer was on diplomatic missions to France and Spain and Italy, perhaps he met a knight or two that had at that time been on crusades in Turkey and Egypt, in Lithuania, and had fought in Spain and Morocco. So Chaucer had knowledge of these events, and he used them in his prologue to the Knight's Tale. So now, what was this tale that was told by our crusading knight? Now, the Knight's Tale is about Theseus, an ancient king of Athens who, according to legend, slew the Minotaur. People may have heard that story. Now, Theseus had many stories and plays written about his life, including an epic poem, Theseid, which was written by Boccaccio. And this is the story that Chaucer used in writing his Knight's Tale, except he changed the ending a little, as we shall see later. Also, this version of the story by Chaucer was used by Christopher Marlowe, along with his protege John Fletcher, in writing the Shakespeare play, The Two Noble Kinsmen. Now, Marlowe also wrote about King Theseus when he wrote about the festival at the wedding of King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta in A Midsummer's Night's Dream. So now our knight begins his tale. Once on a time, as old stories tell us, there was a duke whose name was Theseus. Of Athens he was lord and governor, and in his time so great a conqueror, mightier was there none under the sun. Full many a rich land had he won. What with his wisdom and his chivalry, he conquered all the Amazon country that long ago was known as Scythia, and wedded its queen Hippolyta, and brought her home to his own country with much glory and great festivity, and also her young sister Emily. And so, with victory and melody, I'll let this noble duke to Athens ride, and all his host in arms, and him besides. So that's just the first few lines of the Knight's Tale. Now, this particular tale about Theseus, the king of Athens, was about his slaying of the tyrant Creon, who was the ruler of Thebes. And after this battle, he captured and imprisoned two Theban knights, two cousins, named Palamon and Arcita. Then later, from the window of their prison cell, Palamon saw Emily, the sister of Queen Hippolyta, who was walking in the garden, and he fell in love with the sight of her. Then, to see what Palamon was moaning about, Arcita looked out the window of the cell. He also saw Emily in the garden, and he too fell in love with the sight of her. And the two former friends, former cousins, now acted like enemies over their strife of both loving Emily. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'll let you read it yourselves. I'm just going to skip to the end of the story where Palamon and Arcita end up fighting a duel to the death. But in the middle of it, they're found by Theseus, who stopped them. And Palamon told Theseus that since he and Arcita were Theseus's foes, Theseus rightfully could show them no mercy, but should slay them both. But Hippolyta, Theseus's wife, asked Theseus to have some compassion for them. And so he devised a solution. Each of them would bring 100 knights to fight in a tournament, and the winner was to have Emily as his wife. But Theseus changed his rules for the contest, for the tournament. No missiles, no battle axes, no short knives, no swords, so that no one would be killed during the tournament. They'd beat each other up bad, but no one was supposed to die. And then Theseus had a great theater built for the tournament. And in that, he had 3 temples built, one to Venus, the goddess Venus, one to the god Mars, and one to the goddess Diana. So on the morning of the tournament, Palamon went to the temple of Venus, the goddess of love, and he prayed, not for winning the tournament, but for somehow winning Emily. This is just a little excerpt from his prayer. I wield not my weapons boastfully, nor do I ask tomorrow's victory, nor for renown, nor the vain glory of skill in arms proclaimed up and down. But I would have complete possession of Emily and die in your service. Choose you the manner how, in what guise, I care not, whether it better be to have victory of them or they of me. But if I have my lady in my arms, for though it be that Mars is god of arms, your power is so great in heaven above that if you wish it, I shall have my love. So that was part of Palamon's prayer to Venus. Then Arcita went to the temple of Mars, the god of war, and he prayed to win the tournament. This is just an excerpt from his long prayer. I am young, untutored, as you know, and I am afflicted more, I vow, than ever was any living creature, for she who makes me all this woe endure cares not whether I sink or swim. And well I know, before her love I win, I must gain her by strength in this place, and well I know without help or grace of yours, my strength nothing will avail. Then help me, Lord, let my arm not fail because of the fire that once burnt thee as fiercely as this fire that now burns me, and let me tomorrow win the victory. That was Arcita. But now Emily, she goes to the temple of Diana to pray, the goddess of chastity. She wants to pray that peace will come to both Palamon and Arcita. But if she must wed, let it be to the one who loves her best. This is a little excerpt from her long prayer. Send love and peace betwixt these two, and turn their hearts away from me so, and that all their hot love and their desire and all their busy torment and their fire be quenched, or turned towards another face. And if so be you will not grant me grace, or if my destiny be shaped and you rule I must yet have one of the two, then send me him that most desires me. So then they have the tournament, and at the tournament, Palamon was defeated, and Arcita won, and he won Emily and his wife. So he's parading around the stadium, and as he's riding towards the end, towards Emily, the god Pluto caused the ground to shake, and Arcita was thrown to the ground, and his horse landed on him, and he was mortally hurt. So here's Arcita on his deathbed, and this is what he says to Emily. The woeful spirit may not within my heart show one iota of my sorrowful smart to you, my lady, whom I love the most. But I bequeath you service of my ghost to you beyond every other creature, since my life may no longer linger. I have to my cousin Palamon shown strife and rancor many a day gone, for love of you and out of jealousy. Yet Jupiter, so wise, my soul give leave to speak of him, your servant properly, in every dimension full and truly. That is to say, truth, honor, knighthood, wisdom, humility, and noble kindred, generosity, and all that is of that art. So may Jupiter take my soul's part, for in this world right now know I none so worthy to be loved as Palamon, who serves you, and will do all his life. And if that ever you shall be a wife, forget not Palamon, the gentle man. So Arcita now talked of his cousin with compassion, not as a knight, but he says as a gentle man. And he asked Emily that if she ever does marry, remember Palamon. And then a great funeral was held for Arcita. Now, some years go by, and Theseus was making alliances with other neighboring countries, and he sent for Palamon from Thebes. And when Palamon comes to Athens, Theseus asks Emily to take Palamon to be her husband. And so now everybody is happy and all the prayers were answered. Arcita prayed to Mars to win the tournament. He did. Palamon prayed to Venus to have Emily, which he now had. And Emily prayed to Diana to marry the one who loved her best. But then after this, Theseus gives this extraordinary speech. And I want to talk about this. Theseus says, hang on, let me just get a drink of water. The first mover of all cause above, when he first made the fair chain of love, great was the effect, noble his intent. He knew well what he did and what he meant. For with that chain of fairest love, he bound the fire, the air, the water, and the land in certain boundaries that they not flee. Now, the ancient Greeks had divided the universe into 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. But Theseus says that the thing that binds them all together is not another element, not something material, but something immaterial, love. And okay, by love, he doesn't mean the romantic definition of love. That is really desire. Like when Hollywood says, I love this or I love that, what it really means is I want this, I want that, right? It's like in gratification. That's the romantic version of love. But for Theseus and for Chaucer, love was compassion. And in Old English, compassion, there was a word for compassion, and it was called ruth, R-U-T-H. And if you had compassion, then you were ruthful. And if you had no compassion, then you were ruthless. And that word still exists in the English language today. And in the Knight's Tale, you can count, if you want, the word love is in there 80 times. So perhaps that is what our knight, his tale was about. Perhaps our knight wanted to be ruthful and not ruthless. And okay, Theseus continues. And each man knows, unless he is a fool, that every part derives from this whole. For nature cannot take its beginning from some part or fragment of a thing, but from what is perfect and is stable, descending so until corruptible. And therefore, of his wife's providence, he has so well proclaimed his intent that species of things and their progression shall only endure by succession, and not eternally, I tell no lies, as you may comprehend with your eyes. And I just think that if the first mover intended that, and I put it in bold, that species of things and their progression shall only endure but by succession, then it would seem that our poet is saying that things don't live forever, but things can live on in what they pass on to those things that come after them by succession. And I don't think our poet is referring to a succession of rank or privilege or bloodline, that kind of nonsense. But for Chaucer, after witnessing the Black Death, he might be thinking about how a nature or a culture succeeds with a succession of stories and ideas that are passed on. And I just thought that line was so fascinating to read. Shall only endure by succession. Now, was our knight thinking about what stories he'd be leaving behind? Because if we think about this knight's tale, why did our knight decide to tell this tale? Wasn't he a knight that had fought in the Crusades in 15 battles, it said? So why wouldn't he tell us a tale about bloody battles and daring feats of strength and lust for fame and fortune? Nope. Instead, he told us a tale about not caring who won the tournament, but in forgiveness, and about wanting the best for others and in compassion. Perhaps this is what was really on our knight's mind in making his pilgrimage, because if we think of how some knights were convinced to go fight in some romantic crusade, weren't they told that it was to protect the pilgrims going to the Holy Land? But I've read where it was shown that there wasn't a problem with pilgrims visiting the Holy Land. There was agreements in place. And okay, even hypothetically, even if that was true, wouldn't a knight simply accompany the pilgrims on their journey to keep a watch on them and to keep them safe, instead of riding off on some wild crusade that always seemed to have some ulterior motive to it? Perhaps that is what our knight was doing on this pilgrimage to Canterbury, what he should have been doing in the first place, to accompany and protect pilgrims on their journey instead of going off on some ruthless crusade. Perhaps he too was looking for forgiveness and compassion. But now, we might ask, what did Chaucer really think of our knight, or of knights in general? Well, when we read the other tales of Canterbury, we find that our poet is the only pilgrim who gets to tell two tales. They were supposed to tell two there and two back, but in the Tales of Canterbury, they only tell one, except for our poet, who gets to tell two tales. Well, sort of. He doesn't get very far in telling his first tale when the host stops him and makes him tell a different tale. So here, he starts his first tale of a knight, Sir Topaz, the flower of royal chivalry. Listen, lords, with good intent, and I will tell all truly meant of mirth and of solace, all of a knight fair and pleasant in battle and in tournament. His name was Sir Topaz. Now, in this tale, Sir Topaz had dreamt about the elf queen and how she must become his love. And so he sets out to ride to the country of Faery to find her. But he soon encounters a giant who throws stones at Sir Topaz, and Sir Topaz flees back home. So back home, Sir Topaz calls together his men for wine and food and games and music and jesters. And while he dresses in clean garments and shining armor for his upcoming fight with the knight, that is, until our poet says he drank water from the well as did Knight Percival. And the second that our poet said the name of Percival, the host shouted, "Stop, stop, stop," and cut him off, made him tell another tale. And why was that? Okay, so earlier we saw that Chrétien de Troyes began the romantic Norman myths about the Knights of the Round Table. In his last romance, Percival is the first time we see the Grail, the Holy Grail. In his romance, Percival, the Grail is a dish where washing using this dish will cure one's ills and wounds. A little while later, a man named Robert de Baron wrote Romance of the Grail. And the Grail myth is continued from Chrétien, but in this one, the Grail has been changed into the cup from the Last Supper. And a lot of people know that part of the myth. But then later, a few years later, in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, it was in German, the Grail has now become a gemstone, the stone of the phoenix that has the power to return life to the dead. So when the phoenix gets burnt, it's this gemstone, the Grail, that can somehow shine and bring them back to life. So when our poet's story, when he said the name Percival, he was referring to this Norman myth of the Holy Grail. And the moment he said the name Percival, the host made him stop his story. No more of this, for God's great dignity, quoth our host now, since you weary me with all your tiresome errant foolishness, and also, in truth, and God my soul bless, my ears are aching with your paltry speech. Rhymes like that the devil himself must teach. That must be what's called doggerel, quoth he. Why so, quoth I? Why then hinder me more in my tale than any other man, since I give you the best rhyme that I can? By God, quoth he, and plainly in a word, your idle rhyming isn't worth a turd. You do nothing else but waste our time, sire. In a word, you shall no longer rhyme. Try some heroic tale, let me suggest, or tell something in prose, if that were best, in which there is some mirth or some doctrine. So I just have to laugh. Chaucer used this short, interrupted, and unfinished story of Sir Topaz to make fun of all those romantic tales of the Crusader knights and of the quest of the Holy Grail that he said aren't worth a turd because they had no doctrine or no moral. So, on the advice of the host, our poet told another tale instead, which was a tale with a moral about a young man, Melibœus, and his wife, Patience. And this tale is a story about having to choose between vengeance or forgiveness. But in that first story about Sir Topaz, we read about the elf queen in the land of the fairies. Now, many of us have also read about Titania, who's the queen of the fairies, in Marlowe's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And there's a little painting of it by our friend again, Thomas Stothard. And we may have read about the Queen of the Fairies in Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. There's a little illustration from the Fairy Queen, by our friend Thomas Stothard again. Good. And in the Fairy Queen, we read about a young Prince Arthur looking for the Fairy Queen. And in each book of the story, Arthur learns a virtue like holiness, temperance, chastity, justice, courtesy, virtues that help make a Prince Arthur into a King Arthur. Now, interesting, in the Tales of Canterbury, there is only one story where King Arthur is talked about, and that's in The Wife of Bath's Tale. So I'm just going to read a few lines from the start of it because it's so nice. In the olden days of King Arthur, of whom Bretons speak with great honor, all this land was filled full with fairy. The elf queen, with her fair company, danced full oft in many a green mead. That was the old opinion, as I read. I speak of many 100 years ago, but now no man sees elves, I know. And I thought about that, and I think perhaps we can't see elves anymore because we can't see reality anymore. Maybe our imagination has lost its mirth and its morals, as our host said. And maybe it's mired in romanticism that isn't worth a turd. And so the tales of Canterbury are about trying to uplift the common man and woman in order to recover from the fear of the bubonic plague and the fear of the plague of looting of their economy by some Lombard bankster. And while these plagues were happening to the people in England, what did their Norman king do about them? Well, now, he founded the Order of the Garter to try to recreate the romantic Knights of the Round Table. Now ask yourself, can anyone be any farther away from reality than that? What kind of fantasies were in the minds of this Norman ruling elite? And so England also had to recover from this plague of romanticism. And I'm coming to the end. I hope I haven't taken too long. Although Chaucer would take the lead in developing a system of writing for the then spoken English language, and he would also support a written English translation of the Bible. Nonetheless, for many of the English people, they could not read or write English. And so for them, storytelling was one of the main ways of learning things. And I just wanted to note here, it should be noted that the first printing press in England was set up by William Caxton in 1476. That's 76 years after Chaucer had died. And the very first book that was published was not the Bible, but was Geoffrey Chaucer's Tale of Canterbury. Now, there was a controversy at that time about whether the Bible should be translated into English and become accessible to everyone, or if it should remain in Latin and be accessible only to the few. So, until the time when it was acceptable to translate it into English, I guess you could say that the Tales of Canterbury was kind of a Bible for the common people. First book published in England. Now, we saw earlier how the first king of England to speak English in his court was Henry IV, the son of Prince John of Gaunt, who was also the nephew of Geoffrey Chaucer, nephew-in-law. The struggle to end the rule of the Norman kings in England would later see success when Henry Tudor led a revolt against Richard III and he became King Henry VII. He was the great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt and the great-great-great-nephew of Geoffrey Chaucer. And if we were to read Christopher Marlowe's history plays, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, and Richard III, we'd be able to see more into this whole period to end the Norman kings of England. And I think it is safe to assume that Marlowe must have studied this knight's tale in the Tales of Canterbury when he wrote Two Noble Kinsmen about Arcita and Palamon. And now lastly, I found this most interesting. Because in the Tales of Canterbury, 6 of the pilgrims don't get to tell a tale. They're the 6 workmen: the haberdasher, the carpenter, the weaver, the dyer, the tapestry maker, and the plowman. But those 6 workmen did get to listen to all the tales, so maybe they learned something. Then we find in Marlowe's A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's also 6 workmen: the tailor, the carpenter, the weaver, the bellows mender, the tinker, and the joiner, and that these 6 workmen were the amateur actors who performed a play at King Theseus's wedding feast, and who were able to safely travel from the city of Athens under Theseus through the forest realm of the fairies under Oberon and Titania, the king and queen of the fairies, and then to travel back again. And I wondered, was this simply a coincidence on the part of Marlowe, the 6 workmen? Or was he following upon Chaucer's idea of uplifting the common people? But all of this should come as no surprise to us when we see where Marlowe was born and raised. Because it certainly wasn't in some little backwater town like Stratford upon Avon where they sold bags of wool. No, Marlowe was born and raised in the town of Canterbury, of course. So he not only read the tales of Canterbury, he lived them. But now, unfortunately, today, that feudal order of the Garter that was started in 1348 by the Norman King Edward III during the Black Death, it still exists, with its leading knight, Sir Tony Blair. He's out there crusading around in the Middle East somewhere for his lord of the Order of the Garter, King Charles. So I guess I don't have time to talk about all the other 21 tales of Canterbury, or about the long sermon by the good parson at the end, maybe another time. But as a final thought, I would just like to think that young people today could dream up even more stories that could uplift even more people. Stories that aren't about becoming an obedient squire for some romantic and ruthless knight in shining armor, but like our friend Geoffrey Chaucer, stories that dream of finally seeing the last night in England. So thank you. I hope you have some comments and some questions for me.
Thank you, Jerry.
I'm going to stop this.
Thank you so much. That was good. That was really good. And I like your thesis, the hypothesis that the generation, I've been looking a lot at the more nefarious interpretations of many of the ancient Greek deities and the associated myths. It seems more and more that these terrible witch covens around medieval Europe were a real thing, and they were like really based upon the Diana cult, which was doing very, very bad things in the forests, and were tied to, it seems, even the Order of the Garter, as Cynthia has been also demonstrating in her work. But the idea of the battle over how to interpret this realm of the ancient myths, of the stories of the fairy queen, as a positive thing, as an emblem for the right of using the creative imagination, which is not supposed to be something that the peasants are supposed to access. I like that a lot as a thesis. It's a very interesting theory.
Thank you.
Because what's the morality or amorality behind the meaning of these various symbols and stories, and that's where the battle is located. Is who's going to, for good or for bad, infuse the moral development into a philosopher king, or to keep people entrapped in a psychosis of their own self fantasy, thinking that they're the hero of some giant story where they can then be weaponized like these stormtroopers to go and do crusades and fight dragons and shit.
Yeah,
Great,
like
great
today,
concept.
it's going today. But I think the point he made about stories, they need to get us to see reality better. That's what they're there for. Today we have stories who want us to run away from reality. And you can see the difference between a good story, which, is part made up, or just some fantasy, which is designed to be an escape from reality, escapism. And I think that's this whole idea of the fairies and the elves. If it has a moral and it is, after reading it, it helps us look at reality a little better, then it's a good story. If it doesn't, well, it's not worth a turd. I love that expression.
Very good. All right, we've got a few questions waiting to be thrown at you here. The first one coming in from Uwe. Uwe.
Hi, Jerry, my friend. Thanks for the wonderful presentation.
Danke.
I really love that. And I found it most intriguing. And I was wondering, so there were a couple of references which you had given to stuff related to Germany. So people taking up the tales or the Grail story. But there was also the connection between Chaucer, Dante, well, not Dante, but personally, but then Petrarch and Boccaccio.
Yes.
So that I found highly interesting with regards to the Brethren of the Common Life, which were later, basically, but still they were connected to the start of the printing presses and to the morals in teaching. So I was wondering, is there something which you came across with regards to Caxton and his setting up of the printing press that connects this whole issue also with the Brethren of the Common Life and Gutenberg and the press business, or is this just coincidence?
I don't think it's coincidence, Uwe, but I didn't really go into it that much. I had edited a lot, so I wouldn't be talking here until next week, but I'm sure there is a major connection. But the Italian connection to Chaucer, I think, is paramount because it really shows where it comes from, what became the Renaissance in England. And he was obviously trying to copy Boccaccio. He must have talked to him about how to do it. And you can see all of this romantic Norman myths, and even the ones that, slipped into Germany. It's all around the start of the 1200s, the Third Crusade. And unfortunately, that's what Wagner went back to for his. Whenever I think of Wagner, I think of Rossini. I love Rossini. And someone came to Rossini and asked him, "What do you think of this new music? What do you think of Wagner?" And Rossini says, "Well, Wagner has wonderful moments, but then they're followed by horrible half hours." And I love that line. But you can see, I'm sure you're going to see the same thing in German culture with this romantic myths of the 1200s and how they were brought in, and the Teutonic Knights and all this insanity. And so I just looked at it from the standpoint of England to just show.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Can I follow up a little bit? Matt, is it okay?
Of course.
So of course, this question came to me while you were talking, and I skimmed a little bit the internet and in search of some clues myself. And what I found was that Caxton was, or at least in some sources, is credited with publishing the Canterbury Tales as his first product in England or in Westminster, but he had apparently stuck to publishing those romantic, chivalric tales after being urged by Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy. And so there must have been some tension around the whole issue of which way to go, whether to go the Chaucer way or whether to stick with the crusade stuff.
Yes, it was. Well, it really brings the idea that art is political. It is the most political thing we do. And I'm sure the fight was there, even with Caxton both doing, but he did the Canterbury Tales first. That was the important thing. So he made his mark, and then he had to print some of the other ones. But I think he was the first one who actually wrote about Chaucer's, when Chaucer died, when he was buried in the cathedral, well, the abbey, what they now call Poets' Corner. But yeah, it's just, the point was that because it was the first book printed, that's the one everyone grabbed and was reading. So he made a point of it being the first one. But yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of politics around him and doing that. And, it was also, 75 years after Chaucer died. So I'm not sure of what happened in that period, whether who was king or queen at the time. But yeah, heavily political. I've just scratched the surface. Just scratched the surface. There's more to be done. I just wanted to do it as a way to link up King Arthur with Marlowe as the key piece. And I hope I did it. Yeah, Westminster Abbey. It's there's a whole funny story about. It's okay if I go into that?
You're the maestro, Jerry.
Okay. So, Chaucer never really made a lot of money in his lifetime. And, he was dependent on getting money from the government on that. So then it was maybe a year before he died, he leased an apartment or a place to live in the place in the garden outside of one of the chapels at Westminster. And the rules or whatever for that is, if you died while you were actually living in one of these, houses that were part of the abbey, you got to be buried in the abbey. So maybe that's what he had in mind. So anyway, the next year he died and he got buried. Not a great spot, actually. And according to Caxton, it was just in the ground and just a stone over top, nothing written on it or anything. Although they had records of who was buried where, but there was nothing to tell you that's where he was buried. And then I think it was Caxton and a fellow from Milan that actually wrote a little epitaph for him, a little lead plate, and they hung it on a post so that you'd know where he was buried. And then I think a couple hundred years later or something, they were building another big altar for some other poet that I don't really like. And so they had to dig up Chaucer's grave to put this one in, and somehow they put another, little altar for him. But he was buried in the ground where no one knew except for Caxton knew. But it's an interesting story about his burial.
Yeah, I love the connection to John of Gaunt, which is so important. I mean, just because it does create that bridge between the real King Arthur, that whole fight, and the fact that, you know, Henry VII, who is the great great grandson of John of Gaunt, you have this Chaucer connection, this real Renaissance tradition that's influencing, it seems, in a serious way, John of Gaunt's soul. I guess I didn't even know that was a connection. I didn't know how to think about him, but that then brings in what was brought to the surface with Henry VII, and then his choice to name his son Arthur, who should have been king had he not died the mysterious death right before the League of Cambrai. Yeah. But then that ties right into your Marlowe thesis too, in a fun bridge.
Yes, fascinating connections. Yeah. All goes back to Canterbury.
Marty Seif.
Oh, Marty's there.
To share a thought, Marty, or 18 thoughts.
Okay, Marty. Before you say something, I just have to say one thing first, because all of this presentation I did, it's Marty's fault. It's all your fault, Marty. Because remember a couple of years ago, Marty did this fascinating presentation where he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Christopher Marlowe wrote Shakespeare's play. And I became so fascinated with it, I just kept doing more and more research. I ended up doing a class on Marlowe as Shakespeare, and then there was little ties connected to Chaucer on it, so I kept digging, and now I finally put it together. But Marty, it's all your fault.
Oh, you made his day. You made his day, Jerry.
If I can only get control of myself. Oh, first I got to say, Jerry, yeah, I get a lot of that.
Yeah.
But again, you certainly aren't American, because you're cursed with this uncontrollable modesty. I mean, I learned so much from you, and again here. I mean, there's something that, you know, we all learn about the stories of King Arthur and this, that, and the other all our lives. But for anyone who knows a bit of history, there's always been, and I've never questioned it, but it's always itched at the back of my head. How can there be knights at 500 AD? They're 500-600 years too early. And I just swallowed it. I thought, well, they know better than I do. Duh. Well, they must have been there then. As you point out, there's not a hint of it under the Anglo-Saxons. And everybody knows that. But at the same time, none of us, me included, oh no, they must have been there all along. We just didn't notice. You know, I mean, you've just you owe it all to me. You've just revised 700 years of world history. You've completely revised our understanding of Roman Britain and what happens at the end of it. Completely. And you've completely clarified our understanding of Anglo-Saxon history as well. And one thing I'll add, everyone should look to the most amazing show. You know, the older I get, the more I realize the most important things in our life sometimes come to us in the most casual of ways when we're little kids, you know, from our mom or dad, or from friends, or from teachers, or just playing games on the street, or getting into fights. The smallest things, you know, foreshadow your future or throw light on you. And there was a TV show, and it should be on YouTube, so everyone should look it up. And it was hugely popular in Britain in the 50s. It was called Robin Hood. And it starred Richard Greene. And I just loved it. I thought it was surprisingly well done. And, you know, I got indulged and got the series a few years ago. And I was amazed to see how intelligent, well-written it was and how well it held up. But then when I looked it up online, it turned out it was actually written by a bunch of American FDR New Dealers who had been persecuted and blacklisted by Joe McCarthy and couldn't get any work in America. So they came to Britain in the 1950s, and they weren't communists, but they were social democrats. You know, they were FDR people. And the whole show is written, and it is hugely popular. It ran for about 5 or 6 years, and there are about 200 episodes.
Wow.
And it's all written from a social democrat, point of view. The virtuous, hard-working, honest, agricultural and industrial Saxons are ruled over by the elitist, imperialist Normans, and all the knights are evil. And knighthood is exactly as you described it. Exactly as you described it, Jerry. And it was done so well, and during the children's hour, it always went out at 5 or 6 o'clock p.m. in the evening at tea time, so that it was under the radar. None of the cultural conservative commissars of the old class system in England took it seriously enough to stop it coming there. So it filled all our innocent little minds with naive, stupid ideas like democracy and freedom of the press and open discussion and social justice. And meritocracy, evil subversive forces like that. But you've explained it. And the one other point I'll add is the great mystery of the ages should never have been a mystery at all. Did Camelot exist? And if it did, where was it? Well, yes, it did exist. And it's still there now. And you can still visit the archaeological remains there that are exactly as we're describing. But again, you've thrown light on this too. Because all this business about knights and holy grails and nobility and gallant quests and what have you, really medieval and creepy stuff and neo-romantic stuff is all a lie that comes 500 or 600 years later. But if you look at Geoffrey of Monmouth and the folk legends even before him of the Celts, preserved in Wales, exactly, it wasn't in Wales. We know where it was. It was in the obvious place. It was hiding in plain sight. It was the capital of Roman Britain, the modern city of Colchester. And how do we know this? Well, you come across this. You're well familiar with it.
Yes.
But to remind myself, just even while you were talking, I checked online and look it up. Look up Camulodulum. It's very clear. The name is Camelot. Camelot is a slight variation of Camulodulum. And Camulodulum was the ancient British name for Colchester. And it's on the coast of England. It's directly in line with where the Saxons were coming in. It's where the Brits fought. It would be the natural place for Arthur to be. And the early legends are quite clear. It's a wonderful city of wonders. There's a great Roman amphitheater there. There's a great castle there. And these remains have all been found. But just people forget. People want to believe the medieval neo-romantic nonsense. But you've just clarified where that came from and how it's hundreds of years later. You must give a follow-up on Glastonbury sometime. You must be. You probably don't know it already, but if you don't, you're the perfect person to clean out, separate whatever the wheat from the chaff is there. But Jerry, that was wonderful.
Thanks. Well, there's a real connection to Camelot because it's very near Monmouth. Geoffrey of Monmouth. That's where he's from.
What you've done? I didn't know that. Yeah, go on.
And who lived at Monmouth? Lancaster, John of Gaunt.
Oh my God!
Yes.
The first. I mean, I didn't know until you said it. But the first English king. That's amazing.
And you can imagine Henry IV growing up, or even Henry V growing up at their grandfather's house in Monmouth, and this funny old guy, Geoffrey Chaucer, hanging around with these poems. They grew up on these things.
I think you said in the previous presentation, I may have garbled it, so please correct me, that you have Chaucer, and of course Marlowe's from the same city, and there is a line of teachers and a tradition that comes from Chaucer. Chaucer brings Dante and the great Italian Renaissance and Italian Enlightenment to England, and Canterbury, you pointed out, was the heart of that Enlightenment. And then later on, surprise, surprise, the greatest of them all, Marlowe, who is who. Yeah. It's from the same place.
Yes. It's all there. it's an unwritten conspiracy theory, but there obviously was a conspiracy of minds over hundreds of years seeing the same thing. And even I thought all this crazy nonsense about the Holy Grail, and how you could live forever if you found it. And it's, Chaucer says it right there in King Theseus, right? The idea of succession, that you pass on ideas to the next generation, like you're doing for us, Marty. I mean, that's the idea of immortality. You can't live forever, but you try to, make the world a little better off when you leave than when you got here. So you try to leave something behind for the next generation. And that's the idea of immortality, not finding some stupid grail that will give you eternal life like transhumanism. They don't get it.
Yeah.
They just don't get it, or they don't want to get it. But we're fighting the same battles today. Look at the new crusade Hegseth is on.
Oh my God!
In Iran, it's the same fight that Chaucer was in. It's really no different.
No,
times have changed, but
you did something else though too, and that is something that always puzzled me. I never particularly liked Henry as a king, Henry V. And Henry IV, there's always this question mark hanging over him because Shakespeare, Marlowe, loves kinghood.
Yes.
And
yes.
And he recognized in all his plays he's wrestling with the problem: how do you handle an unjust king, or a man like Richard II, who is sympathetic in many ways but just doesn't have it in him to be king, or fascinating Henry VI, the pious saint, who for that very reason is a catastrophic king. But it all Marlowe's love of England and his ideal king come to a head exactly where you said with those two guys. Because first of all, in the play Henry IV, John of Gaunt gives Marlowe, and I'm convinced Marlowe wrote that after when the School of Night and his arch enemies led by Raleigh had driven him out of the country, and he had to fake his death in the 1590s, and he's desperately full of homesickness for England. And it should be on YouTube. I came across, there was a version of the play done about 15 years ago with, of all people, Hercule Poirot, that is to say, Sir David Suchet, who plays the definitive Poirot in the TV series. And he will play John of Gaunt. And he gives that great speech, this jewel set in the shining sea, this blessed garden, and etc., etc. Obviously, he'd never been to Birmingham, or right. This England, right? And it's exactly the guy you mentioned. It's John of Gaunt, the father of the first true English king, Henry IV. Yeah. And in Henry IV, we have Henry V emerging as Marlowe, Shakespeare's ideal of what kingship ought to be.
Yes. And look where he comes from. He was a wretched, horrible person and hanging around with...
Yes, exactly. Yes. Hanging around with Falstaff. Yeah.
Falstaff, yeah. And then he becomes king, and he totally changes, and he kicks Falstaff out. And I don't know if Henry IV or if Henry V was that good a king, but Marlowe makes him into his ideal of what a king is. And another little tidbit, Marty, you'll like.
Oh, please.
So we don't know when Chaucer was born. We don't even know what year, let alone what day. But we know what day he died. October 25th, 1400. Take all of Marlowe's plays, all of his writings. The most famous day he makes, October 25th, the Feast of Crispin Crispian, and his famous We Happy Few, right? Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day until the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. So, that's the day Chaucer died.
The first great movie version of Henry V is done during World War II. It's actually shot in Ireland, of all things, because it's the only place where they could do it without being interrupted in the fields by barbed wire and barrage balloons and everything to stop the Germans coming in. And it's done by Laurence Olivier.
Olivier, yes, I've watched that one. Yeah,
exactly. But just, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many threads to pull on. It's a gift that keeps on giving. But before we
please,
Marty,
one more very quickly.
All right. Lunch in there. Do it.
One of the greatest Shakespeare adaptations of all time, again, is from Henry IV. And it's exactly on your theme, Jerry, on how this drunken sword becomes the most noble of kings.
Yeah.
And it's called Chimes at Midnight. And it's done by Orson Welles, who adapted it from Shakespeare Marlowe, and he stars in it, plays Falstaff himself, and at the very end, the new young king, Henry IV, actually becomes a prig. He becomes judgmental, and he banishes Falstaff, and it breaks Falstaff's heart, and Falstaff dies at the end of it. There's great pathos in it. Right?
Yeah.
And there's no question Orson Welles' heart is with the common people. And his heart is also he has a vision of the prince, even when he's a drunkard. That's when he's a good guy, because he's one of the people. He has love and sympathy for the people. But when he becomes a crusader himself to go and conquer France, I mean, I'm not saying this is what Marlowe or Shakespeare wrote, but it's how Welles interprets it.
Yes.
But if you look at what Welles had done before, Welles was one of the outstanding champions in the 1930s and 40s of President Roosevelt, who loved his work and often invited him to the White House, and of the New Deal. And of course, he was persecuted again by our old friend J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the rest of them in the 1940s and the 1950s as a quote-unquote communist subversive. So it's like Matt said, and like you say, you pull one thread and it connects you to so much else.
Yeah. It's there.
I'm curious to hear what Carol thinks about what we just experienced.
Yes.
Carol, what'd you think? Did he do it?
I loved it. Fabulous. Fabulous. Fabulous presentation. First of all, just one little comment. I'm sure it's just a little slip up, but
it's okay.
Of course, Chaucer's language was Middle English, not Old English.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Old for me.
It is old. It's
old for all of us.
Yeah, it's archaic, but it's technically Middle English.
Okay. Middle English.
That's just a very. I love the history that you've brought in there, tracing the knight's actual experience is so relevant and really brings it alive in fantastic ways. And I think that's kind of, I don't know, maybe there's a lot of scholarship on that, but I'm not, it doesn't come to mind. So I think you're maybe breaking new ground there to some degree, to actually look at what crusades he was a part of and what they were about is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I had to do it by default when I was reading, where in the prologue where he talks about the knight and he's naming these places and I'm going, where the hell are these places? And, I had to, you do a whole thing and most people get them all wrong here and there. And it's
you actually put it to a historical figure. This Pierre
and Chaucer had him in there for a reason.
Absolutely. Everything in Chaucer is there for a reason.
Yes.
Absolutely. No question. And it is political. Absolutely. As well. He's writing about his time. And as you noted, and this is what completely attracted me to Chaucer, or one of the things that would seem so relevant for the times we were living in. And I still feel that there's a great similarity between his age, coming out of the Black Death, years, and we're in a post-nuclear age, and so I feel
Yes.
like we can really relate to and to these authoritative structures, and so we can relate to so many of the situations
Oh,
that he
it's
was
wonderful.
experiencing.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'll
They
just
lived
add,
through the years of the Black Death, and we lived through the years of lockdown and the mental damage it did to us. I just thought of that,
correct.
Carol.
Yeah,
Because
same
look
thing.
at the mental damage that would do to you living through the Black Death and be terrified, and they were doing weird things to not catch it. And look at the weird things we did, wearing stupid masks, buying 600 rolls of toilet papers. Somehow that's going to protect us.
It's very
Ah,
relevant.
Yeah, that's
Very relevant.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
Carol, that's
and
yes.
and there's so I mean, the thing is, there's so many threads in Chaucer, and that's what I love about Chaucer and obsesses me about Chaucer. So
Yeah.
you've picked one of them, this Grail myth and the Arthurian myth, and it's fascinating, and I'm sure you're quite right about that. Um, uh, but it's one of many. The one that I'm onto that has been kind of a subject of research for myself is I believe that Chaucer was not only exposed to Petrarch and Boccaccio, but also the Persian Sufi poets and in Andalusia and
Attar in
Yes.
particular. Attar.
well, he's one, but
Yes.
more than
And many of
Attar.
Yeah.
I mean, he named his the Parliament of Fulas is has the same name as the Attar's Conference of the Birds, but he would have also been exposed to the writings of Aristotle, the Greek scientific experience, and the Arabic scientific knowledge. And the Sufis kind of combined the Greek and the Arabic teachings, and so when you pinpointed the idea of the elements there, the four elements, and then but all through Chaucer, you'll see this many references to extra, let's say, extra Christian, beyond Christian theology, going back to Greek myth, going astrology, certainly, pagan things, and equally these what I would call Sufi ideas involving
Definitely
like
super important idea, right? How the Islamic Renaissance tradition also overlapped and influenced the best of the Christian European traditions, and there's so many overlaps. We see that everywhere you look between like Raymond Lull and Lorenzo Valla and Fibonacci, and they're all like being influenced by the best of the Islamic scholars. Some of the followers of Moses Maimonides, also from the Jewish realm, who was advising Saladin. They're also like interfacing with the best of the Christian scholars too. So yeah, that's a really important contribution you just made, Carol. I appreciate that a lot. Jerry, do you want to speak to that at all, or?
I've only scratched the surface on it, Carol, but you're onto something, which I pointed out how Chaucer wrote the treatise on the astrolabe.
right. You mentioned that. Yeah.
That he got from Arabic, without a doubt, and which also means what else, but it's the enormous influence of Andalusian culture into Europe, which has been, and then you have, Portugal and Henry the Navigator and, their discoveries around the world. How much of that did he get from Andalusia? So you have this enormous from what I can see, discovery of the Greeks came to Europe through Arabic, both through, Andalusia, and also I've read where Boccaccio and Petrarch were influenced because of the Arabic influence in Sicily. And then the Pope invites the Normans to come down and take over from them. But you had the Islamic Renaissance and all of Persian culture too, coming into Europe through Italy from Sicily, through Europe from Andalusia. And the translations of the Greeks, you have the Greeks were translated into Arabic, and then you got to do Arabic into it. And the reaction to that by let's say, the noble families in Europe was the revival of Latin. And what followed was this massive push in the universities for Latin, anything Latin histories, Latin poets, most of which was crap. I mean, some of it, Cicero is very good and some other stuff, but most of this other stuff. But there was a massive push for the revival of Latin in the church and in the universities, I think, to counteract this influence from Sicily and Andalusia.
Wow.
And what were the Crusades about? They weren't religious. They're allying with the Mongols to fight, the slave runners. And Venice is running slaves to the Sultan of Egypt, who overthrew the Islamic Sultan, and he was a former slave. Yeah, it's coordinated. And also the point I made before on the Christian, we call it Christian countries of Europe, but they really were not very Christian. My God, they were the unchristian countries of Europe. And also at that time of Chaucer, most of the Islamic countries were very un-Islamic. Muhammad V in Granada, Andalusia, was very Islamic, very good. But the rest of those Islamic emirs along the coast there, they were rotten. The one in Turkey were rotten, the one from the Mongols. So it's the un-Islamic ones and the un-Christian ones in Europe. And you had this whole crusade run to stop this positive Islamic current from coming to what few real Christians there was in Europe. But yeah, that's
very interesting. I'll just add a couple more comments.
Yes, please.
I see that the Sufi poetry is all about the divine beloved. It's love poetry, but to the divine beloved. And so I see that
Rumi.
As well, beyond Rumi, all of them.
Okay.
Fees.
Yeah. All the Persian poets pretty much use that as a metaphor for the souls seeking the truth. And so I see that as translating into, when it comes into Europe, bringing in this whole troubadour romantic approach, which but coming from that previous poetry where it was a spiritual romance.
They left that part out.
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes secular, and and that's an interesting thing, I find. And then and you bring up this thing of this, romantic myth. Well, that's kind of part of this whole thing that happens with this probably I don't know, philosophical pursuit that then takes on this earthly secular form. But and then the thing about the Celtic otherworld, that's certainly one of the that's all through Chaucer, is this is invoking this Celtic otherworld, the world of fairies and creatures, and I
And
remember.
there's a reason they did that.
Yeah, I am not 100% clear on it myself. I
Well,
remember my professor calling it, charming but malignant.
no. It was okay. You ever listen to opera Bellini?
Maybe.
Okay. So I love Bellini, but he writes this opera, Norma.
Norma, I do know. Oh, I've sung one from Norma.
And yeah, it's set in the year 1 BC. So because it was before Christ,
Right.
you could talk about all this pagan myths and you could bring the fairies and the Greeks and all this stuff. So if you talked about these old Celtic myths that were before the time of Christianity, you could get away with all this stuff. And, the same with the Greeks. You wanted to bring all these Greek myths in because they were really emotionally dealing with certain ideas and philosophies, but you couldn't say that,
Right.
at the time, or the Inquisition, you'd get your head chopped off. So if you wrote about, the Greek myths, you could get away with it. You could say, so this is before Christ. Don't worry, that's what it was like. So a
Right.
lot they did that deliberately, but when I saw Bellini do the opera in the year 1 BC, it was
Right.
just too obvious what he was doing.
And of course, Chaucer at the end of his life supposedly recants and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've written all these pagan, texts and stuff like that."
I don't know if he wrote that or not.
I don't
but there
think he
was,
wrote it personally at all.
well, there at the time there was this huge fight about trying to get the Bible translated into English. I mean, why shouldn't you? Unfortunately, the person who was doing it was a man named Wycliffe. And John of Gaunt was financially supporting him in the effort. Chaucer was helping him in the effort. But, translating into English is one thing. That's a good idea. Wycliffe developed certain ideas that weren't acceptable among the church at the time. And so they went after him sort of like a mini Inquisition. And so it implicated John of Gaunt and Chaucer in that. I mean, they just wanted to have an English Bible. He didn't necessarily agree everything Wycliffe was into, but
there is a theory that Chaucer was murdered. And there's
Yeah.
a book called Who Killed Chaucer?
Yeah,
Probably
it's
about
possible. The
But it
best
wasn't the
thing,
pythons.
yeah, by
Yeah,
Terry.
Terry, what's his name?
What is his name? Yeah.
but the best thing to read is the very last tale in the book, which is the Parson's Sermon. Chaucer's not really friendly with the nun's priest or the friar. He doesn't really like these guys. He thinks they're frauds, they're just in it for the
Definitely.
money. But this old parson, country parson who didn't have, 2 pennies to rub together, he liked this guy. And anyway, he gives this long sermon at the end. And I think if you read that, you're going to kind of read Chaucer's religious beliefs. That's how we got away with it. Because, they were watching him because of the Wycliffe connection. So,
right.
Yep.
So I just will finally conclude that when he in the little passage from the Knight's Tale that you noted, when he talks about the 4 elements, and then there's something beyond that. Well, there's the Sufis held on to the idea of there's a 5th element, which is ether, spirit,
Yes.
and love as being this primordial essence that brought everything into being. So I think so much of Chaucer's work, like certainly all through the Canterbury Tales, but many other works as well, it's really an exploration of many sides of love, I think. And so you might be correct that this is about, that little passage is about pity or ruth or compassion, empathy, It might just be about this this other force, which is love, that has created all the elements and differentiates into the physical world, but actually they then will return to this state of love. And I'm not sure about the succession thing. I think it might be actually talking about succession of leaders, because you bring up this thing of he was supporting Pedro and all that, so it might also be there too, or it might just be a comment on evolution as such.
Most poetry, it's ambiguous what he
Right,
means, and
Yeah.
I like that
Well,
phrase.
it has two meanings,
Yeah,
right.
and you got to figure out which one is he talking about here. Yes,
Yeah.
Chaucer does that. But the thing I noticed in the part about love and the four elements, he says love holds them together. And,
Right.
this goes back to there's, Persian, Greeks. But what the Neoplatonists did was say there's two forces that hold it together. There's love and strife, and they're equal, right? That's this Manichaean nonsense, good and evil.
Right.
But Chaucer doesn't say that. He says, no, it's only love.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Strife is just a lack of love. There's not two forces. There's
No,
one.
great.
It sounds reminiscent a little bit of Plato's Symposium as an exercise in different hypotheses about the nature of this thing, right? And there's elements of truth in each one, but at the same time, there's a lot of poetry, and you're just working on hypothesizing what is the essence of this thing we call love, and how do we understand it and activate it.
It's not the baby boomer love.
No.
It's not the Beatles, love, love, love.
Well, that too.
That's I want.
Well, that was actually, Jared. Do you have time for a couple of quick additional thoughts from the audience, or do you?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I'm retired. I got all the time in the world. I like talking to people. I sit alone during the day sometimes, and I'm bored because there's no one to talk to, and I walk outside and buttonhole someone and talk his ear off. So bring on the questions, no problem.
Well, all right. Well, this is actually more of an observation, but you might like to speak to it. Uwe had noted, he apologized, he had to leave, but he said that what you were describing regarding the fight over the Latinization campaign going on in this period would match the rise of scholasticism in favor of the Platonic epistemology, no? So he's sort of throwing that at you.
Interesting.
Yes, I think he's absolutely right. That's the scholasticism we know is this revival of Latin, and that is when they did a complete translation of all of the works of Aristotle. Was right then, that period. They had heard of Aristotle in bits and pieces through the Arabic, and also bits and pieces of Plato. I think that through the Arabic, they had the Meno dialogue and the Phaedo dialogue, which are both so important. So they had that from the Arabic, and from the Latin, I think they had only part of the Timaeus. So it wasn't later till they got the rest of them. But, they had reviews of Plato's dialogues by Arabic writers, so they knew all of them and what they were about. They didn't have them, but they had little bits and pieces of Aristotle. But, Uwe's right. With this scholasticism and this push for a revival of Latin, they also did a complete translation of Aristotle. They brought that in, and it's I think even today you think about it, that someone doesn't want an alliance between the unchristian countries and the Islamic countries. Someone's just like at the time of Chaucer, they didn't want that to happen. They had to launch the Crusades because even Charlemagne had that alliance with You've talked about it, Matt, al-Rashid. So there was something going on. And even you see with Pedro, he was fluent in Arabic as well as, and he had Jewish scholars and Arabic scholars in his court. So it wasn't just Andalusia, but also, Castile. And then they had to bring the whole crazy crusade in Spain to wipe that out, and the Inquisition,
right,
which was part of that
Jews
too.
were
So
expelled.
yeah.
That actually touched on what Marty had brought up in the comment section. Marty wrote saying, was the crusade and the destruction of Constantinople in 1204 by the Venetians also an attempt to block the Enlightenment coming in?
Well, I don't know for certain. I have my own views. I could be crazy. Some people say I am. They could be right. But my thesis of the fall of Constantinople is before that time, there was no pope in Rome. They had 5 bishops: the Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Constantinople, the Bishop of Antioch, Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Alexandria. And these 5 together, through, whatever dialogue, established the doctrines for the Christian church. It was only after the Crusades and the fall of Constantinople that you had the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, become the Pope. He was master over all the Christian church in the world. It wasn't, before that, it wasn't. They list popes going back as all crap. Which is also part of the schism, where the Orthodox Church, which really the Russian Church really was out of Constantinople, they said, screw you. We want to keep it the old way, where each bishop has a say over that section of the church, instead of having one. They pass this crazy law that the Pope is infallible, that it's impossible for him to make a mistake. And, as Catholics, we had to believe that stuff. So, but that's what I think about the fall of Constantinople, because it's like they were trying to resurrect Rome. And so they had to capture the popes, they had to capture the bureaucracy in Rome to capture the Catholic Church. They had to launch a crusade to stop the influence of the Islamic Renaissance coming in. They had to, conquer the other 5 bishops in the Christian church. That's my theory. I could be wrong, Marty, but I'm sticking with it. But there's an awful lot of work to be, because it had nothing to do with religion, right? The first thing they did when they started a crusade was kill all the Jews, and then they went to try to kill the Muslims every time. What kind of a religion is this? My goodness. Oh. But yeah, it's opening up a whole re-understanding of our history, of our past. And if we could do that, maybe we can stop these stupid crusades by Hegseth. And I knew it. If you heard Hegseth talk the other day, he gave a press conference, and he said, we are going to defeat Iran and we're going to fight them. And he said, without mercy. He said that. And I said, what an evil thing to say. Without mercy. What kind of a war you're fighting? And then I remembered something Lyndon LaRouche used to say all the time about wars. He says, most generals only know what they think about how to win the war. They don't know how to win the peace, which is more important. After a war, you have to establish a peace with the person you just fought. I mean, there's no way on earth they can establish a peace with anyone in the Middle East the way they're conducting it now. That's the problem with the people of around Trump. They don't know how to win the peace. And when Hegseth said, without mercy, it just, boom, boom, the lights were going off, the alarm bells were ringing and everything. And I think you really see it in Chaucer. You see it in his, Book of the Duchess is the same thing. This idea of compassion. You see it in the Knight's Tale. You see it also in the Parliament of the Birds. Is you have to have this conception of compassion, of mercy. Otherwise, what are you fighting for?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
very well said, Jerry. Very well said.
Yeah.
And your class couldn't come at a more important moment where it is clear that the same old recipe book has been opened up to the same page as it was back in the days that Chaucer lived. And in the days of Peter Abelard, who was battling, Bernard de Clairvaux and all these Satanists back 1,000 years ago, who were pushing some weird millennialist end times reset. It's not a new idea. It's an old recipe book. It's been done many times, and every time it's applied in stupid people who don't know this history and don't know the nature of their own mind in the battle of higher ideas, they always fall for the same trap, and disasters, messes, crusading wars of bloodbath go on, and we don't want this to happen again. So hopefully, I think that Chaucer, wherever he may be, is smiling right now after having listened to your contribution. I really do. Richard, I see you want to get in there with a last thought there. So
I was just going to add one last thing, and then you just said it, Matt, that in Chaucer's time, they really believed, it was a common culture, that the end days were at hand.
Yeah.
That was like that was the place they were operating from, and I think we're right
Same
back
as
at
today.
that.
And I'll just say this too. Monty had just shared a little link from Wikipedia that on the sleeping Arthur, right? The legend of the sleeping Messiah Arthur that would emerge at this millennial moment, which a lot of people were pushing back then.
Yes.
And that also kind of falls into certain messianic or people who are thinking from a similar vantage point today, looking at certain orange actors in positions of power in the United States as sort of like this new the reawakening of his forebears. Bad ideas, nothing new under the sun, right? Bad ideas are recycled if we don't know this past and we can't nip them in the bud properly.
Yeah. I just want to add one final thing. Marty, you'll like this, because today is March the 15th. So maybe we can be like the soothsayer telling Julius Caesar, the president, beware the Ides of March.
Yeah.
All right, that's I think a perfect way to end today's presentation. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and looking forward to meeting back again same time next week.
All right.
Okay.
Good
Thank
stuff.
you again.
Thanks.
That was like so exciting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carol.